Dr. Victoria Nalule, thank you very much for joining us here for the Happy Smart City podcast. A very important interview this is going to be, and particularly because of Africa's growing youth demographic and rapid urbanization. So the truth of the matter is, young people require a lot of activity, and they have a huge demand for energy. And to really support this youth demographic and the changing face of the African economy, we need a lot of energy to support that. And it's going to be a really, really interesting one. So thank you for availing yourself and sharing your wonderful experience and your insights. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be attending or participating in this podcast because I'm very passionate about the energy sector, African energy sector, which also definitely is related to smart cities and ensuring that we are moving towards a clean energy economy. So I'm very happy to be here and I can't wait to share my expertise with you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So I'm just going to let everyone know that I've benefited quite a bit from your LinkedIn, and I've actually attended some of your webinars as well. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So your question, we're going to start off with the first one, Dr. Nalule, and that is, what is your current occupation?
All right. So currently, I'm running an NGO. I'm the founder and executive director of an NGO called the African Energy and Minerals Management Initiative. In brief, it's called EMI. And in this NGO, we are more focused on energy and mining, specifically to see how the African youth can contribute to the energy sector. We have various programs under this NGO. We have the Women in Energy and Mining, where we empower women in both professional women, but also the unprofessional women who are based in rural areas or women who are involved in small scale mining. We also have the EMI mentorship program, where we mentor young people who are interested in the energy and mining sectors. And we also review various energy and mining legislations for governments and other African countries. And besides that, I do guest lectures for various universities. Through my consulting firm, we have collaborated with universities, including universities and institutes, for instance, the Institute of Petroleum Studies, where we collaborate to offer affordable short courses in the energy and mining sector to various Africans who are interested in the field. And we're soon concluding an MOU with an institute in Burundi, where we'll be offering short courses and executive trainings still in the energy and mining sectors. And I also do work as an external examiner for energy and mining dissertations, master's dissertations at Uganda Christian University. And I'm also a guest lecturer at the East African University. And previously, I've worked with universities in Europe, including the Queen Mary University of London, the University of Dundee, and I also did some work for the Columbia University in New York. So that is briefly about me. But besides that, I would like to note that I'm an author. I'm very passionate about writing on issues related to energy and mining. I have 4 books. One, which is very important, I think, for this podcast, is one focused on energy poverty and access challenges in Africa, where I tackle the role of regionalism. I have another book on mining and the law in Africa. I have a book on energy transitions in Africa. I have another book on land access and extractives still in Africa. And I'm working on 2 book projects focused on dispute resolution in the energy sector, and another one on an edited book on the future of mining in Africa. So I'm an author. I like to write. I like to research. I also like to get involved in different initiatives. So that is the brief about me.
So amazing. I mean, this is also very inspiring. And as you speak, I'm thinking about a South African gentleman who, and I don't mean to make this about money or anything, but he's a billionaire in dollar terms, and he started off selling, just snacks next to a mining facility. And eventually he used that money to go to university, studied to become a lawyer, and worked his way up. And just from starting at the very beginning, acquainting himself with the environment, developing a love for the extractives economy, and eventually becoming, a professional, he was a priceless asset to a lot of mining activities because he knew the industry from the bottom. And so I guess you can see people graduating into non-executive positions on boards and eventually executive positions. And so what you are doing, to me, is exactly what needs to be done, because you're not just trying to work with people at the very top on the executive, but you're also saying that you help community level projects that help with maybe beneficiation or just other supporting activities. And if people can start young enough in these supporting activities, they can really grow into ownership positions once they become professionals. So very, very important work that you're doing. And I'm sure everyone can agree. Very, very amazing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind words.
And so the next one is, how does your role contribute to the economies of cities?
All right, so my role right now, it will be, I would phrase it as the role of a researcher. So the first role is, as a researcher, I do lots of research in the energy and mining sectors. And in the recent book I wrote, we actually talk about smart cities, but in the aspect of land access and extractives. And that is an issue that is always overlooked, because if we're talking about smart cities, we also have to ask ourselves, are we only going to focus on urban areas? Is that what we want to focus on when we're talking about smart cities? And obviously the issue of low carbon economy. But what about the mining communities? How can we ensure that these aspects or the ideas we have of smart cities can be decentralized or extended to other communities in rural areas, in mining communities? So with my role, obviously, we work with local communities through the NGO, where we go to mining communities. And the recent project we're actually pushing for is to ensure access to solar energy in mining communities. But that also, you have to ask yourself, what is the role of energy in ensuring smart cities? Are you going to have a smart city without access to electricity? Are you going to have a smart city where 60% of the people are relying on traditional energy, that is biomass, including firewood for cooking and candles for lighting? So all these things, you have to ask yourselves, what really makes up a smart city? And in order for us to have a smart city, the first thing we need to do is to tackle the challenge of energy poverty, tackle the challenge of energy access, ensure that people actually have access to clean energy. That's when we can be able to talk about smart cities. So through my research and my activities, I emphasize the need to ensure that everyone has access to clean energy, because it's key. That is like goal 7 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Without access to electricity, we cannot talk about smart cities. You can agree with me on that. Without access to modern energy, we cannot have access, we cannot achieve the goal which relates to good health living. How are you going to have a smart city where most of the hospitals lack access to electricity, most of the schools lack access to electricity? So as an African and as a researcher who has written a lot on Africa, I emphasize throughout my research, I emphasize the need to first tackle the challenge of energy poverty or energy access before we can even think about moving forward with any other objective, including smart cities or including achieving all the other UN Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm, mm. And you make a very important point, because this whole issue of smart cities has the ability to create a huge gap between the wealthy and people in the rural areas, because it's a lot cheaper to scale the fourth industrial revolution in a city because everything is so close, and so you reduce the cost. But once you move to peri-urban areas and the rural communities, then which aren't centralized economies, literally distributed, the cost becomes a bit more expensive, right, for infrastructure. But this is a conversation that we had, to a very, very deep level with a sovereign wealth fund in Africa. Actually, last year, we had 4 months really discussing last mile coverage and distributed energy. Solutions there, and I'm not sure, what type of feedback you can provide, but we're thinking last mile coverage for communications, which is obviously these smart devices, would be low Earth orbit satellites, where you have these a mesh or a star constellation of many, many small satellites that provide wide area, coverage for internet communications, and very high speed, by the way. But the one challenge that I still see is energy, powering the fourth industrial revolution, because most distributed energy solutions for electricity require, photovoltaic solutions, and the research and price and performance for photovoltaic infrastructure in the form of solar cells is still very, very challenging. And I'm not sure what you can say about that.
Um, I think the issue you've raised is very important, and I would the only thing I have to say is, when we're talking about smart cities, we're talking about technology. And remember, this technology, it's all powered by electricity, whether we like it or not. And with electricity, now I'll give the example of South Africa. You look at the main source of electricity. And in the case of SADC countries, it's mostly coal. And this will bring in the issue of, when we're talking about smart cities, what kind of energy are we going to use to power those smart cities? Are we going to focus on clean energy, that is solar, like the one you've mentioned, wind energy, hydropower, or are we also going to utilize fossil fuels? And to be realistic, if we're to talk about smart cities in Africa, that means we'll need to utilize all the energy resources we have, including fossil fuels, including oil, coal, and that means that
I'm going to have to ask that we hold on that later, because it's actually a full question that deals with the energy mix.
all right, okay.
Okay, okay. Sorry about that. We're really going to get into it soon enough. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is: could you share some of the latest figures on energy coverage in Africa?
But this is also, it doesn't relate to all African countries, because Africa is not like a single country. So it depends on the country you're talking about. But I'll talk like, I'll give examples, let's say in East Africa. You look at energy coverage, you have to differentiate between the geographies of energy, including rural areas and urban areas. So if you're talking about rural areas, you will notice that 60% of the people are using biomass to access energy. That is, with biomass, we're talking about traditional energy, including charcoal and firewood for cooking, and then candles for lighting. And then when you talk about, when you go to the urban areas, and you're looking at the energy coverage, you'll see that most of the people, maybe there are some who are using biomass for cooking, but that will be like 20%, and then 80% are already embracing modern energy that will include electricity and LNG for cooking, for lighting and cooking respectively. So with energy coverage, we can't talk about Africa as a whole, because you have to know which country you're talking about. And also, besides the country, you look at the geographies. Which region are you talking about? Is it the urban area or the rural area? but the general analysis is in most rural areas, in most developing African countries, most people are still relying on traditional energy, which takes up like over 70% or 60% of the energy mix or the energy coverage.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you. And it's really important that you make the distinction that Africa really isn't just one uniform jurisdiction. It really is a multiplicity of countries with different levels of development. So thank you. Your next question, Dr. Nalule, is what are the causes of Africa's energy gap? And to what extent can capital markets innovation and institutional coordination be leveraged to service the gap? So essentially what we're saying here is what's causing the Africa infrastructure energy gap? And how can we improve, in financial innovation and also coordinating the different institutions to service this, infrastructure investment gap for energy?
So I'll start with the issue of accessibility, because I noticed that's why you want to focus on, which includes the issue of energy infrastructure like electricity transmission lines, the refineries we need on the continent to be able to utilize the energy resources we have. Also the transboundary pipelines that are essential for us to be able to utilize electricity. And energy investments, including infrastructure developments, are very expensive ventures. And what is really causing the gap is basically the lack of access to the finances, because as African countries, we don't have enough money to finance these energy infrastructure investments. So that's why in most cases, we require foreign investors and foreign companies or foreign energy companies to come in with the necessary capital to be able to utilize the resources or exploit the resources for the benefit of the people. So the main thing is lack of finances, because energy infrastructure is very expensive. And that's the main issue with the gap on the issue of accessibility, which is focused on having access to electricity, but also having the necessary energy infrastructure in place. And then the other issue that is really causing the energy gap is the issue of affordability, because you find countries, and this is not even related only to African countries, which have the necessary energy infrastructure in place. People can access electricity, people can access reliable electricity, it's sustainable, but how much money are they paying for that electricity? Can a poor person in rural Africa afford the electricity benefits in their area? So the issue of affordability, actually, most people can call it energy poverty, because it also applies in developed countries, where even countries like the UK, where they already have accessible electricity, you find that the poorest people find it hard to pay for the bills. So it's the same thing with African countries. And that is also causing the gap, because the issue is not all about having the necessary infrastructure in place, energy infrastructure, but you have to think about the people who are going to use that electricity or that energy. Can they afford it? So those are the main issues with respect to the energy gap. For poor countries, most of them lack the necessary infrastructure, because these are very expensive ventures. And then for other countries, rich countries, and also some African countries, developed countries that have access to the infrastructure and everything, there's the issue of affordability, where in most cases, many households will spend a lot of money to pay for electricity bills. And then your second question relating to this is how can we tackle this gap? Was that it?
Yes. So just speaking to how do we tackle this gap and accelerate, the infrastructure flows, because clearly, I mean, we're operating, or at least the African continent is part of a global society, and it's competing in global capital markets. So how do African nations then position themselves strategically and even coordinate their national institutions to better attract, whether it's regional investment or global investors to service this energy gap?
Most African countries have already put in place initiatives to attract the necessary capital. And the first thing when you're talking about energy investments or even the finances to flow into a country, you need reliable, you need an effective investment framework. How is the investment environment in that country? How are the laws? Are they effective to protect energy investors, foreign energy investors? How are the institutions? How are countries tackling the issue of corruption? So in most countries, you'll see they have already amended their energy laws. They have already amended their investment laws in order to make a conducive environment for investors to come from wherever they are with their capital to invest in these countries. So that's one thing. At the national level, you need to make sure that you have a conducive environment to attract the investors. Because as an investor, they're not charity organizations. They're more concerned about the investments. They're concerned about making profits. And also they're concerned about ensuring that at the end of the day, whatever they have invested, they can take it back. And the first thing to do to ensure that the investor is confident in your country is to create a conducive environment, legal, regulatory, and also institutional environment. Put the laws in place, which most countries have done, and also strengthen the institutions, which still most countries have done, and they're still doing that. But besides that, we also have to think about the issue of regionalism, because we're, like you mentioned, it's more of a global economy right now. No country can stand alone on its own. And with the issue of regionalism, my first book was on the role of regionalism in tackling the energy challenges we face in Africa. You have to appreciate the fact that most African countries face common energy challenges, like the challenges I talked about lack of access to modern energy in most rural areas, the issue of over-reliance on traditional biomass, the issue of indoor air pollution, whereby we're having most of our people dying of diseases that are related to indoor air pollution due to over-reliance on firewood and charcoal. So those are the common challenges we face in the African countries. Also the issue of lack of access to modern energy infrastructure. So looking at the common challenges we face, most countries have embraced regionalism to tackle these common challenges. And with regionalism, we say we can employ common solutions to tackle the common challenges we face on the African continent. And also regionalism is a good way to attract investors, because if you go like in the SADC region, and you are sure that there is a region agreement that is protecting energy investors in the SADC region, that is Southern Africa.
That's very important. I like this concept. Yeah, you may continue. I'm just really impressed. Yeah, thank you.
So if you go like in SADC and there are 15 countries, SADC countries, and the investor is sure that if I go in South Africa, there is a regional treaty, a regional energy treaty that will protect my investments. So the investor will come with his finances, will come with his capital, and he will not only invest in South Africa, but he knows he can also go and invest in Mozambique. And then he can also extend his investments to Malawi, extend his investments to Namibia. So you see that with this uniformity in tackling the common challenges we have in Africa, you're going to attract more investments. And remember, investors are interested in making profits. So they will know, if I only invest in South Africa, I'll be getting less profits. But if I invest in the SADC region as a whole, then that means I can easily benefit from these 15 countries. And the countries, what do they get in return? They're getting the capital they need. So in my book, I emphasize the role of regionalism in tackling the common challenges we face on the African continent. But I would also like to mention that there are already regional initiatives to solve these common challenges we face on the African continent. In ECOWAS, they have the ECOWAS energy protocol that provides, it has lots of provisions, including protection of investments, energy investments in the ECOWAS region, that is the West African region. In East Africa, they're moving forward with the various initiatives, including the regulation of energy markets at the East African level, and the harmonization. Now, I talked about the issue of having the laws at the national level, but then can these laws be harmonized at the regional level, whereby we know that the laws in South Africa, they're harmonized with all the laws in other SADC countries, the energy laws. So that's one way of ensuring that Africans can actually benefit from the capital that is flowing in different African countries. And also the other thing I would like to note on this issue of closing the gap, the energy gap, it's also the issue of employing regional energy infrastructure. Like I mentioned, the issue of pipelines. Now we're seeing the development of the East African pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania. Those are all regional energy infrastructure. It's not only going to benefit one country, but it will benefit Tanzania, it will benefit other East African countries. So you see this issue of regionalism and regional cooperation in solving the common challenges we face in Africa as being key in covering the energy gaps we have on the African continent. And for the listeners out there who are really interested in the issue of regionalism or exploring regionalism to tackle the common challenges we face in Africa, feel free to look out for my book, or you can contact me for a free soft copy, because I tackle all the various regional mechanisms we can use to solve the challenge of energy poverty or to cover the gaps in the energy sector on the African continent.
Lovely, lovely, lovely. And, you know, I can agree with the issue of regionalism, but I'd never really thought about it from the energy perspective. And it's just triggered a whole different way of looking at things, because energy is really at the core of the economy. It's at the heart of everything. But I've personally, you know, traveled and even advised on policy, on delegations with the SADC, with some of the SADC officials. I mean, we've traveled to as far as the Maghreb, and you know, meeting with Middle Easterners and Northern Africans, but that was mainly in technology and telecommunications. But from an energy standpoint, I mean, it seems to me like when you have sort of a regional agreement, it makes things so easy, because even the logistics, think about it. I mean, even the logistics of moving the oil across different borders, you know, whether the oil is moving from Engen in South Africa, moving into Botswana and Lesotho, it just makes things so harmonious. Even the policies don't have to be really complicated, because at the core would be dealing with, you know, the same treaties or agreements. And so it just harmonizes, like you said, everything on one platform. So that is so fantastic. I will now move on to the next question, which is, to what extent are current energy demands a result of poor planning, optimization, and infrastructure? Now, I'd just like to say here that I think that we have, to an extent, touched on these issues, but I still think that there's still a lot to be said about infrastructure, asset management, whether it's maintenance or the planning of this infrastructure in terms of financial planning, and so forth. So can we talk about how are we treating our infrastructure, taking care of it, planning properly in order to, you know, to provide energy for our communities and cities?
Thank you very much. I think we already tackled this question, as you mentioned, but I will just comment on it briefly. With respect to planning, initially the problem that most of our African countries were making is to mainly focus on urban areas. That's why you're seeing, when we're talking about the energy demand, you see that in most rural areas, that's where the challenge of energy poverty or energy access exists because of the poor planning, obviously, because these regions initially were never given a lot of attention. And also that includes with respect to infrastructure development in these regions. It was never there. And we forgot that most of our people are based in these rural areas. But right now, we have seen lots of initiatives to resolve this challenge or to correct the mistakes we had made in the past. So you will see in most countries, they have like the Rural Electrification Authority, an agency that is mostly focused on ensuring that ensuring that the people in rural areas have access to electricity. And that includes obviously making sure that in their planning, they put aside money for energy infrastructure to be extended in those rural areas. So, and the issue of rural electrification is not only at the national level, but even when you look at the regional level, you see regional organizations focusing on the issue of rural electrification. So that is the mistake we made in the past. But right now, with respect to planning, I think most countries are rectifying the old mistakes. But the other issue you talked about is how are we maintaining the infrastructure we're putting in place? And that is very key. Are we training the local people to have the capacity to maintain this infrastructure when these foreign companies that are putting the infrastructure in place have left? That would be the question. And the answer to that is yes, for some countries, they're doing that through initiatives, including local content, whereby most foreign companies are required to train the local people so that in case these companies leave, then our local people can be able to maintain the infrastructure, so that it's not a matter of putting infrastructure in place, energy infrastructure, and then after 5 years, no one can maintain it and it's just stranded. It's like a stranded asset. You can't operate it, you can't use it. So you invested a lot of money, but you cannot benefit from the infrastructure. So the main key here with respect to infrastructure maintenance, obviously they need to have finances, but also building the local capacity so that we know our people also have expertise and we don't have to run to foreign countries every time something has happened to the infrastructure. You have to run to a foreign company to come and maintain it. So those are the only comments I would have for this question.
And, when we talk about these issues, what also comes to mind is the fact that with modern technology, you've got smart grids, these centralized massive behemoths of software that help you manage infrastructure project management and even monitor the state of the infrastructure hardware. So for example, in the age of IoT now, there's all these different sensors that help you monitor the performance of different pieces of hardware and even the software to determine if there's maintenance required, and maybe if not maintenance required now, but what does the future schedule look like and how do we start planning forward on that regard. I'm just really curious to know to what extent is machine learning, IoT, and all the smart grid infrastructure being used in Africa. I mean, that could be a new conversation all on its own, but that's just what comes to mind. I mean, how robust are our infrastructure asset management systems? Now, the next question is, can you describe Africa's current energy mix? Also, considering rapid urbanization and the projected proliferation of IoT networks, what will the energy mix look like in 2030 and 2050? So just to, sort of condense this one and simplify it, where are we now in terms of energy? I know we've also addressed that to a very large extent, but can we talk about the way forward in very tangible terms to say, okay, well, the next 10 years, 2030, this is what we expect. 2050, this is what we expect. Of course, there's, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. How is that road looking right now? And what can we talk about tangibly?
So with the energy mix, in most African countries, you will see, now I'll give the example of SADC countries. There's still a high reliance on fossil fuels for electrification, for transport, and other industrial sectors. But we're also seeing lots of investments in renewable energy. And given that most sub-Saharan African countries, there are fertile grounds for solar energy and also wind energy. So we are seeing lots of investments in renewable energy. We're seeing lots of solar projects in different countries, in different communities, including rural areas. So we're seeing renewables not dominating, but also playing a significant role or significant part in the energy mix. Now, when we're talking about the Africa we want and the issue of urbanization that you mentioned, you see that most African countries are developing countries. That's why I told you the issue of the geographies of energy use or energy access. It's very important. Given that most countries are developing countries, we are moving towards development, obviously. We're moving towards urbanization. We're moving towards industrialization. But most importantly, there's the issue of population growth, because data shows that worldwide, like the African continent, most of the African countries will contribute to the global population growth. So with population growth, urbanization, and industrialization, it means that the demand for energy will increase. And if this demand for energy is increasing, that means that we'll have to utilize all the energy resources we have. Yes, we're moving towards smart cities. We're moving towards a low carbon economy. But the question would be, can really renewable energy, can we rely on solar, wind, and hydropower to take us through urbanization that we are all eager about, to cater for the population growth that we're expecting to increase on the African continent? What about industrialization? Will all these industries be able to rely on renewables? So being genuine about the status of most African countries, taking into consideration that most of our countries are poor and we want to be like the West. We want to be like these European countries where we know that even if you go to a rural community like where I come from and you see a city, it will be an urban city. All that will require lots and lots of energy. So in my opinion, I will not quote any data, any international data. In my opinion, where I see the energy mix for Africa, it's where we'll be able to utilize all the resources we have, including oil, coal, gas, and all the renewables, to be able to cater for this urbanization, cater for the population growth, cater for the industrialization. So I don't want to quote any data because obviously not all data is reliable. You quote the World Bank data, it's different from the International Energy Agency data, but I'll just use common sense and say that if we want to be like European countries, we have to ask ourselves how much energy and what kind of energy did these countries use to reach the level they're at right now. And once you get, sorry?
So I thought you were done, sorry.
Yeah, so once you have an answer to that, then you realize that the energy mix will not change that much, in my opinion. Renewables will play a big role, but we'll also need fossil fuels to take us through all these developmental dreams we have for the continent.
And I I hope that everyone that's listening can appreciate that we say this with all humility. But the truth of the matter is, we're aware of climate change. We're aware of, the quality of air that's depreciating globally. But at the same time, we still have people in Africa who don't have access to clean drinking water. And even the water that we're talking about, needs to be transported, and you need energy to pump that water. I mean, the most basic things. So, I mean, you can even talk about the food security, right? There's still huge demand for basic balanced diets in Africa. And to power those logistics, quite frankly speaking, electric cars, the African continent is not ready for that. So we will still depend very much on oil to help us move, commodities within our borders. And I will agree with you 100%. I think the African growth story, truly speaking, organic economic growth that reflects, the demographics, the geography, and everything else, cannot simply rely on renewable energy. And that has to be, put into the foreground. What we could rather talk about is, how do we do industrial scrubbing, and create much more clean processing, clean processes as we treat the energy commodities at their different stages before we consume them. I think those are conversations that make a bit more sense in terms of optimizing the production of energy. But talking about having a majority of clean energy, I think that would be a fallacy altogether. Now, the next question.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Before we go to the next question, I'd like to add on what you've said. Relying on fossil fuels doesn't mean that countries are climate change deniers, because one thing you also have to look at is, how can we use the finances from the fossil fuels to invest in renewable energy? Because not all countries have fossil fuels, but those countries that have fossil fuels, they can use the finances to actually invest in clean energy, to invest in renewable energy projects. And that will also be another way of tackling the issue of climate change. So not that people are climate change deniers, because there are already initiatives in different African countries to tackle the challenge of climate change. There are already initiatives to utilize renewable energy. There are already initiatives to invest in clean technology like carbon capture to utilize these fossil fuels. So just because a person is honest that a country might need all the resources to benefit its citizens, doesn't mean that they are climate change deniers, but we just have to be realistic and see if we can actually use the finances from these fossil fuels to invest more in clean energy or in clean technology, and also invest more in renewable energy projects. That's all I wanted to add.
Now you know why I invited you onto the podcast, because it's things like these that, and so many more things that you touched on during your own webinars that really resonated with me. And your level of innovation and policy is, to me, is really impressive. And precisely, it's, you talk about the responsibilities of different stakeholders and what we should expect of them as major polluters, right? And so that simple issue of expecting the people who own fossil fuels to sort of be expected to try and improve the equation going forward, that is so amazing. Now, the next.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're like,
I was just saying thank you. Thank you for the compliment.
You're like Africa's rock star in the extractives economy. Honestly speaking, I love your work. Now, the next question for you is, what level of pollution can we expect from the energy supply of Africa's mega cities, and what can ESG mandates do to address this? So, as far as the previous comments were concerned, you were talking more at a national level, what, you know, polluting nations should be expected to do. But at an investor level, for investors that are, sustainably conscious, and really, really caring for the environment, what can they do, in terms of tackling these pollution issues?
There are already initiatives to tackle the issue of pollution, including taxation of carbon and carbon pricing, actually. And there are also already initiatives to invest more in clean technologies like carbon capture to ensure that we utilize fossil fuels, but in a sustainable manner, in a less polluting manner. And I was actually saying that through, throughout history, we have seen that humans will never run away from problems. We are so innovative. Whatever problem, whatever challenge we've been faced with, people have always come up with solutions, including this current COVID-19 pandemic. You see, there are already solutions, there are already initiatives to tackle the problem. So it's the same thing with respect to pollution from the energy sector. Initially, obviously, many companies and even countries were reluctant on the issue of pollution, on the issue of the environment, on the issue of climate.
Unfortunately, having to come to a very abrupt stop, we had been battling with a very, very bad Zoom communication there. It wasn't really stable. But after the discussion, myself and Dr. Nalule agreed that we had the gist of the information in the recording, and so we hope everyone's enjoyed that. And thank you very much, Dr. Nalule, for helping us here with your insights and all your knowledge. Much appreciated, and we look forward to working with you, and sustain this relationship going forward at the Happy Smart City Forum. Thank you.